looking at the functions of blood. One of them is transportation. Blood is going to transport many materials throughout the body. For example, things that gets transported would be oxygen, carbon dioxide, different nutrients, there's hormones, and there's lots of waste products inside of the bloodstream. Blood also has a regulatory function. It's going to regulate things like body temperature. It helps regulate the water volume of the body. It also helps regulate the pH of the bloodstream. Blood can function in defense. We can defend against pathogens by using some of our white blood cells. We can also defend ourselves against blood loss through blood clotting. If we took a test tube of your blood and stuck it in a machine called a centrifuge, which is going to spin it really fast, all of the cells are going to sink to the bottom, and the plasma is going to be left on the top. So you can kind of see by this picture that your red blood cells make up about 44% of the total volume of your blood. The plasma makes up the majority at 55%, and your white blood cells and platelets make up a very small percentage, about 1%, and that would be in the center, it would be floating in the center. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the components of blood. We just mentioned some of them on the previous slide. The first that we'll talk about is something called plasma. Plasma is the liquid component of the blood. So it's what the cells and nutrients and hormones and everything are floating inside of. There are a few plasma proteins that you can find inside of the bloodstream. One of them is called an albumin. Albumins are responsible for maintaining the plasma osmotic pressure. They act as OAPs, an osmotically active particle. So if you remember back when we did osmosis, that a particle that did not diffuse through a membrane was going to, let's say, create a gradient for water movement, and we said that water always wants to dilute. These albumins are one of those particles that don't move through the membrane, and as a result, they are pulling water into the bloodstream. Another plasma protein is something called a globulin. Globulins are lipoproteins, and they function mostly in immunity. So they, again, help in defense of the body. We also have some clotting proteins that are floating around inside the plasma. They are in a soluble form, so they're not clotting until you get some tissue damage and need them to clot. Other things that you're going to find inside of the blood include electrolytes, so things like potassium and sodium chloride, waste products such as carbon dioxide, nitrogenous waste from protein metabolism, different nutrients that you've taken in, so maybe amino acids, maybe monosaccharides that you're going to use in metabolism of the cells. And of course, our hormones. So if we are trying to direct the body to do something, a hormone is going to come into play. The first type of cell that we find inside of the blood is a red blood cell, otherwise known as a erythrocyte. Erith as a prefix means red. Structurally, these are biconcave discs. So if you've ever had a breath saver breath mint, they kind of look like that. They don't actually have a hole in the center, but it's depressed a little bit in the center. They have no nuclei. A mature red blood cell loses its nucleus. And literally, it's just a big sack of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made up of 4 polypeptide chains. And I think we actually mentioned hemoglobin when we did some of the organic chemistry in the very beginning of the chapter. Very beginning of the semester. Hemoglobin is going to have a heme group that contains an iron atom. Each of the hemoglobin molecules can bind 4 oxygen. So each of those iron-containing groups can bind 1 oxygen molecule. When it is bound to oxygen, we call it oxyhemoglobin. Binding occurs in areas of high oxygen concentration, such as the lungs. So when the blood runs through the lungs and there's lots and lots of oxygen, it's going to bind right up to that hemoglobin. In addition, it's going to bind in areas that have a neutral pH, so again, the lungs is a good example. Oxygen will be released from the hemoglobin, which will then become what we call deoxyhemoglobin due to the lack of oxygen bound. That's going to occur in areas of low oxygen concentration. For example, as the blood moves from the lungs, let's say out to your big toe, the tissue in your big toe might need that oxygen. And as a result, we're going to release the oxygen to the tissue. Additionally, we would lose oxygen from hemoglobin in areas that are acidic. In the event that you were doing some exercise, were in an anaerobic situation, and your muscles, let's say, were undergoing lactic acid fermentation, you would release that oxygen to the tissue simply because it needs it in order to get back out of oxygen debt and start creating more ATP via aerobic cellular respiration. Hemoglobin also has the ability to bind CO2. However, the binding sites for oxygen and CO2 are different. This is what a picture of real red blood cells look like, so you can nicely see some of the biconcave disc shapes in the cells off to the right where you see just the side view. This is a hemoglobin molecule. You can see that there are 4 polypeptide chains, 2 in red, 2 in pink. And then there's the iron-containing heme group in the center of each of those polypeptide chains. We're going to look at something called the hematocrit. This is the percentage of the blood that contains red blood cells. Men have about 43 to 49% of their blood containing red blood cells. Women, on the other hand, are going to have a little bit lower amount, so they have about 37 to 43% of their blood containing red blood cells. This is important basically to diagnose different situations. Anemia is an example where you may have inadequate numbers of red blood cells. In addition, you could have something called polycythemia. Poly means many, so in this case, you would have high numbers of red blood cells. That would cause your blood to be thick, and that's a problem because of clotting purposes. All right, we're going to look at the origin and the life of a red blood cell. We mentioned earlier that red blood cells don't have a nucleus when they're mature, therefore they cannot reproduce. So all blood cells start as a stem cell. They live for about 120 days, and at that point they are taken out of circulation by a macrophage. A macrophage, by definition, is a big eater. So macrophages are going to phagocytize old, worn-out red blood cells. But your body is, fairly efficient, and so we're going to recycle some of those products. The hemoglobin is recycled, and the protein portion is broken down into amino acids. Those amino acids can then be used to make other proteins in the body. The iron is also used to make new red blood cells. And then the heme portion is broken down into a pigment called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a yellowish pigment that's secreted with bile, and it's responsible for giving your urine and your feces its color. You may have heard of a condition called jaundice. Jaundice is when you have increased levels of bilirubin in the body. It can indicate problems because of increased red blood cell breakdown, or it can indicate liver problems. This picture kind of shows you that in the bone, you're going to have all of your blood cells created by a stem cell. At the top is your erythrocyte, or your red blood cell. You can see that as it matures, it is in fact going to lose that nucleus. All right, now we're going to look at the regulation of red blood cell production. So what determines when you need to make more or less red blood cells? Let's say that our stimulus is a decrease in oxygen concentration, so there's not enough oxygen floating around inside of our bloodstream. Our kidneys are going to detect the drop, and they're going to release a hormone called erythropoietin into the bloodstream. Erythro, again, refers to red, so erythropoietin is this hormone that's going to increase red blood cell production. I did put in parentheses that this is an example of an endocrine function. Erythropoietin then stimulates the red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. The increased number of red blood cells returns to the bloodstream and they can then carry more oxygen, thus increasing the oxygen levels to normal. This process is called a negative feedback system because a stimulus in one direction, in this case a decrease in oxygen concentration, results opposite that or an increase in the oxygen levels. This picture here just describes the same thing. So if your stimulus is a decline in oxygen availability, the kidneys recognize that. They're going to release their hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin travels to the red bone marrow and it causes them to start creating more red blood cells. Those red blood cells get out into the bloodstream, and of course, as they're in the bloodstream, they can carry oxygen. It increases the oxygen in the bloodstream and thus has effectively maintained homeostasis via the negative feedback system. Now let's go ahead and take a look at white blood cells, or leukocytes. There's a couple different types. The first group of them is called a granular leukocyte. They're named as such because when they're examined under the microscope, they have dark staining granules inside of them. The first type is something called a neutrophil. These are the most abundant at 60% of the white blood cells in circulation. Their function is to phagocytize small particles. The next type of granular leukocyte is something called an eosinophil. Eosinophils are infrequent. They're only about 2 to 4% of all white blood cells. Their function is to defend against parasitic worms. It doesn't seem like a large function, of course, in our country because we are a developed country. We have a fairly safe food supply. But in other countries, let's say, that don't have such a safe food supply, it might be beneficial to have a white blood cell that protects against parasitic worms. Additionally, eosinophils can help moderate allergic reactions to ensure that your allergic reactions don't get too out of control. The last type of granular leukocyte is called a basophil, and just a heads up that any of the leukocytes that are granular end in the phil. These are the least frequent at 0.5%. They release something called histamine. Histamine is going to initiate an allergic reaction. Now we're going to look at the agranular leukocytes. The first of those is something called a monocyte. These are 5% of the circulating white blood cells. And they function as macrophages, so big eaters again. Their function would be to phagocytize large particles. Lymphocytes is the last of the white blood cells. These are about 30%. And these are responsible for immunity. We have two different types of lymphocytes. There's something called a B lymphocyte. These are going to produce antibodies. And there's a T lymphocyte as well. T lymphocytes are going to target specific pathogens. An easy way to remember the relative number of white blood cells is a little mnemonic that says, "Never let monkeys eat bananas." And so the most frequent of the white blood cells is a neutrophil. The next most frequent is the lymphocyte. The next most frequent is the monocyte. The next most frequent is the eosinophil. And the next most frequent, or I guess in this case the least frequent, would be the basophil. So if you like that mnemonic, go ahead and go with it. Again, it's never let monkeys eat bananas. All right, that brings us to platelets. Platelets are fragments of a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. Their function is to clot the blood, to inhibit blood loss. There's a hormone involved called thrombopoietin. When thrombopoietin is released, we would cause increased platelet production.